Hello, this is a companion to my last video, which was a top 15 fantasy novels focusing on stuff that I felt was relatively under-discussed in sort of online book spaces. And so I'm going to do the same thing with science fiction. I am not as much of a sci-fi person as I am a fantasy person, but I still read a pretty solid amount of sci-fi. And like my other video, I tried to avoid many of the obvious choices for recommendations. So I didn't put any, Arthur C. Clarke on here, even though I love Rendezvous with Rama. I didn't put on any Asimov, even though I am obsessed with Foundation. I didn't put on any Heinlein because he's a bad author. No, but seriously, I will disclaim that if you are a huge sci-fi head, I don't think these books will be too out of left field or surprising, but I think they might be if you are less familiar with sci-fi. For consistency's sake, I am also going to do a top 15 for this one. Instead of a top 10, I will just start off with number 15. Ash, A Secret History by Mary Gentle. This is actually kind of a left field pick right out of the gate because this is a book that doesn't classify easily because it is an alternative medieval history with fantastic themes, but it also brings in a lot of sci-fi elements. You often see it grouped with like epic fantasy or, historical fiction or whatnot, but I am choosing to categorize it as sci-fi because I think it was nominated for a couple of sci-fi awards like Arthur C. Clarke or whatever. This book is an absolute chungus. This is the UK edition where it is currently sold as one tome. In the United States, this was actually split up into 4 smaller books, but those are out of print. So when I wanted to read this, I had to get the 500,000 word British edition, which I believe to be basically the second longest work of contemporary speculative fiction, right after Tad Williams' Two Green Angels Tower, which normally has to be split into 2 parts. What this actually is an alternate history about a warrior woman named Ash, who in the same vein as Joan of Arc gets sort of these divine psychic messages that help her preternaturally win battles. Except instead of being in 100 Years' War France, Ash leads a mercenary company in late 15th century Burgundy. Remember Burgundy? That kingdom that for 30 years existed between Germany and France? That got crushed mercilessly and divided up between those 2 polities? Well, Mary Gentle does. It's like one of those memes. I wish someone would look at me with the love that Mary Gentle looks upon late 15th century Burgundy. Absolute fidelity to descriptions of battle tactics and clothing styles and whatnot. But this is decidedly an alternate history. So you have all of these weird elements like Carthage still existing, and they have psychic golems and whatnot. And as you go along, there is actually a frame story in between every chapter of modern researchers in our present day reading the scrolls that are written by Ash. And they're saying, oh, wow, okay, like our carbon dating proves that everything in this book happened, but everything that is portrayed in this book clearly did not happen, right? And so they're just trying to solve the mystery of like, how are these like authentic documents portraying these obviously fictitious events? And that is kind of the real science fiction angle that sort of drives through the entire book. I do recommend it, but I put it at number 15 due to a huge caveat. One, this is 500,000 words. It could have been 400,000 words, let's be real. And another thing is that this book is front-loaded with sexual assault because you follow Ash from her earliest childhood up until growing to be this badass warrior woman. And so there's some very unpleasant sequences right up front of just like what happens to a unaccompanied orphan in a war camp, right? You know, a lot of readers will find that deeply unpleasant, so I want to give you that warning up front. Another warning about its content is that partway through the novel, Ash gets pregnant, and this plot leads to the most heart-wrenching and disturbing portrayal of miscarriage that I have ever read in fiction. It like left me feeling hollow for weeks afterward. It's so distressing. Good book, but lots of caveats. Number 14, The Stations of the Tide. Actually, it's just Stations of the Tide by Michael Swanwick. I recommended him on my other list for writing Iron Dragon's Daughter. This is maybe his most famous work of science fiction, but it is decidedly soft science fiction because it is sort of a psychedelic reinterpolation of Shakespeare's The Tempest. You have this unnamed bureaucrat who goes to a water planet. The water planet, Camino. No, it's not Camino. It's named Miranda. Get it? Like The Tempest. And anyway, he has been tasked by the Galactic Empire or whatever to track down a techno-wizard. There is a wizard on this water planet named Gregorian who is supposedly using technology, forbidden technology, in order to do all of these seemingly magical acts. And the powers that be are really uncomfortable when you have this sort of technology loose on a backwater planet. And so you have this bureaucrat who is exploring the planet, trying to pursue leads. He is accompanied by, I guess you could call it his best friend. He has this self-moving, three-legged briefcase that follows him around everywhere. You can kind of think of the luggage from Discworld, if you remember. Getting into real shenanigans, like doing drugs, having weird sex. You can tell it's very 80s in that way. It's very like late new wave. Michael Swanwick was kind of writing it as a tribute to Gene Wolfe. So you have all of this ambiguous world building, and you never quite know where the novel is going. Even in the last stages of the book, when there's like twist after twist after twist, motivations keep shifting and whatnot, I kept thinking like, where is this going? Where is this going really? And then in, I think it's basically the final page, maybe even the final paragraph, is some new information presented that flips the entire book on its head. It recontextualizes absolutely everything that came before. And that was just such a wonderful moment that it really makes me want to go back and reread this novel sometime. Number 13, I actually don't have this novel, but I do own its sequel that I haven't read, so I'll show that to the camera. It's Inherit the Stars by James P. Hogan. Inherit the Stars is this work of 1950s or 60s, very hard sci-fi for the time. Pretty similar thematically and structurally to Rendezvous with Rama. What happens when a group of astronauts find a human corpse on the moon? But not just that. The human corpse is 50,000 years old. So you can imagine every single field of science is like, shit, we are going to have to radically re-upend our understanding of modern knowledge to try to get why there is a 50,000-year-old corpse on the moon. It's a space archaeological mystery, which, if you've played the excellent video game, The Outer Wilds, it's so much in that vein. Or you can think of it like the Ridley Scott movie Prometheus, but what if all the characters were actually competent instead of huge stupid idiots? So you have like a physicist, you have a biologist, you have an anthropologist, and they are all attacking the problem from different positions and different leads, and they are all using their own knowledge in order to try to solve the mystery, and they're like piecing the puzzles together. It's deeply satisfying competency porn. You get to watch these scientists doing science and being very good at it, and then it leads to lots of like wonderful twists about the state of humanity and the state of the universe. Number 12 is China Mountain Zhang by Maureen F McHugh. I just ordered the Tor Essentials edition just so I could have something to show for this video. I read it a long time ago. I actually read it for a now defunct podcast that I used to run. My co-host was Chinese American, so every once in a while we would read Asian American tinged fantasy or science fiction literature, even though that wasn't the main point of the podcast. We read China Mountain Zhang. We were pleasantly surprised by it, and we also read a certain book that won't be named, which is the worst book I have ever read in my adult life. China Mountain Zhang is written in the early 1990s, and it is a truly intersectional novel, and I don't say that lightly. It posits a future Chinese communism takes dominance on the world stage. You have China as kind of like the biggest cultural and political power. Chinese people, and that includes Chinese Americans, are sort of in this elevated position that they might not have been in the old world order under the United States or Western Europe. So we follow this guy whose name is, on paper, on official documents, his name is Zhang. You know, the characters are China and Mountain, hence the title. But that's not really his name. His name is actually Rafael, because he is half Hispanic, and he is also gay. And so, because of that, even though he hypothetically has all of this privilege and all of this access, he is internally suffering. He has to suppress his true self, both in terms of race and sexuality, in order to get ahead. And throughout this book, you follow Rafael throughout the entire stages of his life as he basically comes of age and sort of comes to terms with who he is. And it is not a novel where the whole world is changed forever. It's just following the life of one guy. I think its portrayal of various progressive themes is refreshingly subtle compared to some of what we have today. Number 11 is 10 Billion Days in 100 Billion Nights by Mitsuse. This is considered one of the greatest Japanese science fiction novels ever written. It was written back in 1967, I think, but it is still pretty unknown in the United States. It didn't get translated into 2011. I've never seen it at any stores. I had to buy a used copy. And, you know, when it came to me, the matte jacket was already all smudged and whatnot. And you're like, okay, is this the best we have to offer? But anyway, this is an influential work of Japanese science fiction where you follow, first, in their different time frames, the lives of Plato, Siddhartha Gautama, also known as the Buddha, as well as Jesus Christ of Nazareth. You cut forward several million years, as you could say, you cut forward 100 billion nights. All of these figures are still existing due to various ways during the heat death of the universe. And then they fight. They fight with lasers and psychic powers and whatnot. This is a legitimately well-written and philosophical book, but it's a very premise of Jesus and Plato and Buddha fight each other with lasers. It unlocks so much of Japanese culture with you. Like, finally, Fate Stay Night makes sense. You're like, ah, yes, okay, there is a historical precedent throughout Japanese popular culture of reinventing different historical figures and having them fight each other with lasers. One of my highlights of this book is actually the first chapter where Mitsuse describes the slow creation of the universe over the course of 5-10 billion years just by subtly describing the waves of existence rocking back and forth. It's such a hypnotic way to write that it really lulled me into this book before it really became crazy. Number 10 is The Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny, which is a completely unrelated book written in the 60s about Asian gods fighting each other with lasers. Lord of Light is about a world that was previously colonized by astronauts from Earth. But once they landed on this planet, I believe they used their kind of advanced technology to set themselves up as gods over the native population. In doing so, they chose to take on the persona of different Hindu gods. For example, like Agni, the god of fire, right? He has a death beam, stuff like that. They have a machine which allows them to reincarnate whenever they can, but they have sort of a karma system where it's like you need to accumulate enough social credit score in order to be allowed to use these reincarnation machines and to sort of maintain your life or your youth forever. And so I think Roger Zelazny does a really clever job of taking all of these different concepts from dharmic religions and then reimagining them in science fiction terms. But opposed to these Hindu gods is our protagonist, who was once one of their number, but he chooses to take on the persona of the Buddha so that he can sort of lead this peaceful resistance against their reign of terror. I also want to share my other cover that I have for this book. Obviously, you have Shiva up here, I believe, and then he is looking down on a Tibetan monk with a computer. It's so stupid. Number 9, Ursula K. Le Guin is one of the absolute greats. Most science fiction lists will put The Dispossessed or Left Hand of Darkness as one of their top books of all time. I love both of those books. I especially love Left Hand of Darkness. I think that's my favorite of all the Heinisch novels, even though Rocannon's World is very underrated. But I am not going to do any of the Heinisch novels because we're going to do something different. I am going to spotlight The Lathe of Heaven. I think she wrote in the early 70s. But this is a book about a guy who, when he dreams, he warps reality. Just think about how scary that is. Whenever you're waking up from a dream and you have that moment of like, uncertain for these brief milliseconds what's real and what's not real, and you have to kind of like settle back into reality. But imagine that for this guy, that never happens. He is just like, his dreams keep changing the material world that he lives in. And so this book is about him being assigned for his various mental illness and drug use, because he has a hard time coping with this, to a sinister therapist who takes it onto himself to encourage the man to warp reality for the better. Except, like, you can't just control dreams. And so it has these absolutely disastrous consequences. For example, when the book starts out, there's huge overpopulation. Everyone is suffering because of all of the congestion, and there's just not enough resources to go around, so there's mass starvation and whatever. And one of the first things that the therapist does is he's like, hey, how about you try to dream up a world where there isn't overpopulation? And what that leads to is global pandemic. Like 50% of all human beings dead from pestilence and disease. Like, such a horrible and disturbing way for all of these noble goals to play out. And of course, Ursula K. Le Guin has always dabbled with Taoism. She actually did her own translation. Well, translation. It's complicated. But she did her own translation of the Tao Te Ching, the Book of Changes, which is, you could argue, is the holy text of Taoism, but that's a long story. I have it on a different shelf. I have multiple shelves. This isn't my only shelf. You're looking at maybe 10% of my book collection right here, if that. Does that scare you? I'm saying that because Ursula K. Le Guin was so influenced by Eastern religions, especially during this time period that she is writing in, this is a book that really emphasizes like how you shouldn't try to change the world by force. You shouldn't try to dominate it to your will. You should just try to go with the flow, so to speak, and to find like peaceful solutions, and that will lead to far more happiness in the long term. Number 8 has a lot of books. It's The Solar Cycle by Gene Wolfe, but not Book of the New Sun. The rest of them. Years after Book of the New Sun, Gene Wolfe wrote follow-up novels in the same universe called Book of the Long Sun and Book of the Short Sun. And while most of them are not directly related to New Sun, they are very worthy works of speculative fiction on their very own. So first off, we have Book of the Long Sun, which was published in 4 books. This is the 2-volume set from Tor. I think it's difficult to talk about Long Sun without low-key spoiling the premise, so forgive me for that. Book of the Long Sun follows a civilization that is contained entirely on one long spaceship, which is sort of implied early on to have been humans that were shipped off of Earth before it became the Earth of Book of the New Sun. Generations and generations of humans who grow up on this ship called the Whirl, absolutely unaware that there is a world outside of the spaceship, because the spaceship is perfectly cylindrical. Think of Rendezvous with Rama or the sides from Mobile Suit Gundam. You have a giant halogen beam in the middle of the spaceship that rotates, and that's what creates day and night. That's the Long Sun. Patera Silk is a priest in the state religion of the Whirl who worships these Greek-inflected deities that are not who they appear to be. But early on, Silk gets a flash of inspiration from what may or may not be the Abrahamic God, and that inspires him to go on a quest to save his community center. There is a gangster who wants to put the community center out of business, and Patera Silk is just there for the orphans. He's like, I can't let these kids be out on the street. He has this very small scale quest. I just want to save my community center. What can I do? Can I get money? What can I do? The scope of what he is trying to accomplish spirals radically out of control. All of these different like political faction and all of these rival gods and all of these opposite nations get pulled into what becomes a conflict involving the entire world, and the whole time you just have a guy who wants to save his community center. What makes Book of the Long Sun so fun is how absolutely different it is from Book of the New Sun. It's written in third person, and Patera Silk is just this upstanding guy. He's kind of this Superman figure where he's like kind of annoyingly too upstanding. I'm not going to read anything right now, but every single character in the book just has weird speech patterns, and it's so funny to imagine like Gene Wolfe writing all these bizarre speech patterns. I am slowly collecting the original hardbacks as well. I so far only have 2 of them, Nightside the Long Song and Calde of the Long Sun. And this copy of Nightside the Long Sun, which I picked up in Westport in Kansas City, Missouri, is signed by Gene Wolfe. It was just on the shelf, and I bought it, and I said to the cashier, holy crap, can you believe that this was signed by Gene Wolfe? And he said, that's crazy, man. Book of the Long Sun is followed up by a sequel trilogy, a direct sequel, so that's why I'm including both of them, called Book of the Short Sun, On Blue's Waters, In Green's Jungles, and Return to the Whirl, which follows a character named Horn, who is a minor character in Book of the Long Sun, a full generation after the events of Book of the Long Sun. Humanity, or at least a portion of humanity, has now settled on a star system. They are living on the dual planets of Green and Blue, which seems to be fine, except for the fact that it's infested with vampires. Horn is tasked to find Silk, the protagonist of Book of the Long Sun. And so Horn goes on his quest, but he is very unreliable in his written narration. Book of the Short Sun is basically a stylistic and thematic synthesis between Book of the New Sun and Book of the Long Sun. Short Sun brings in a lot of the same narratorial unreliability as Book of the New Sun had in very different ways. And so the game is just trying to figure out what is going on. I read through the books earlier this year. I did not grasp everything. I can promise you that. I'm excited to reread them again sometime, and hopefully I can pick up more. I just wish someone would tell me where Silk is. Where is Silk? Where is he? Number 7 is The Best of R.A. Lafferty by Rafael Aloysius Lafferty. Just like China Mountain Zhang. R.A. Lafferty is pretty obscure today, but he is beloved by authors everywhere. He is mostly known for the novel Past Master. R.A. Lafferty, even though he produced a dozen novels, is mostly known as a short story writer. And so The Best of R.A. Lafferty, the Tor Essentials re-release of some of his most famous works, is A, the first R.A. Lafferty I ever read, but B, I'm recommending it because it's the most easy to find today. R.A. Lafferty writes short stories that are both mind-bending and satirical, but also written in this sort of folksy narrative voice, which tracks because he was a lifelong resident of Tulsa, Oklahoma. I'm not sure if he ever left the state throughout his entire life. A lot of critics will kind of refer to these stories as tall tales and whatnot because they have this heightened absurdity, but also heightened sense of reality. But I kind of think of them as more Norm Macdonald routines. Like, I read most of these short stories in Norm Macdonald's voice. Wry, shaggy dog stories where sometimes you'll get an interesting twist, and most of the time you won't. And the fact that you don't get the twist, that you get that complete denial, that leaves you going like, what? Oh, okay. That rich aporia is what really gets you addicted to R.A. Lafferty. My favorite story in this collection is Write a Tin Can, which tells the tale of these anthropologists who are investigating this race of alien goblins, but they are sponsored to do so by this big multinational corporation on Earth. It has lots of shades of Gene Wolfe's Fifth Head of Cerberus in that you're learning about this people and you're also learning about their culture and whatnot. But it has one of the single most viscerally upsetting endings I have ever read that has stuck with me to this very day. There's another R.A. Lafferty short story, a far more humorous one that I love. I think it's Interurban Queen, but it's one that posits a future where high-speed transit becomes the norm, and this is sort of seen as like a utopian gesture, as a saving boon for humanity, because it means that people will no longer have to drive cars around, because it posits that only an absolute sociopath would want to willingly drive a car. And so it's a future where people get into like Old West style hunting posses to shoot down car drivers like rabid dogs, because I think there's a line like, there is no man, no matter how noble, who will maintain his decency and humanity behind the wheel of a car. And I don't know, let me tell you, on this on this highway, I didn't have road rage before I moved to this state. Let's just put it that way. I despise every single human being who drives a Ford F-150. They're all sociopaths. Number 6 is the Terra Ignota Quartet by Ada Palmer. This is actually my second take because I spent 20 minutes rambling and getting lost in thought, because the long story short is that this is one of the most fascinating, dense science fiction reads I have ever read, and also just like one of the best science fiction novels I have encountered from the last 20 years easily. There are just more ideas in one book than some authors have in their entire bibliography. I think that some of them will hit for the average reader and others won't, but it doesn't matter because there's just so many of them, and basically 98% of them hit for me. It follows this world where post-World War III, about 500 or 600 years in the future, where the nation state as we know it today has kind of broken down, religion is outlawed, gender expression is outlawed. They kind of decided to solve gender by just using they them pronouns for everyone, and they're like, it's fine, we don't have to think about gender anymore. But it explores how maybe this one bandage fits all solution isn't nearly so great of an idea. And in this world, all human beings don't subscribe to nations anymore for the most part. They subscribe to hives, which are kind of an evolution of the nation state, where instead of being part of a country, you are part of a collective of humanity that subscribes to one ideal or another, such as the environment or technology or universal human empathy, stuff like that. Due to the proliferation of nearly instant air travel, where people are zipping around the entire Earth in flying cars, it allows people from all of these different, sometimes antagonistic hives to live right next to each other. You can have neighbors that belong to all of the other nations within a stone's throw. And so you have this human society that has been stagnant for 500 years, and Terra Ignota asks the question of what happens when they finally come into armed conflict. How disastrous would that be when the whole world is just so intertangled? This story is told from the point of view of a convict who tells us he is absolutely insane and twisted, named Mycroft Canner, and he is assigned as part of his penance to tell the story of the events of this book, but he is deeply unreliable. From the start, he's like, I'm going to write this entire story in the style of Voltaire and Diderot, and what are you going to do about it? And you're like, oh, okay. So he is already taking this very arch narratorial style. Ada Palmer takes many cues from Gene Wolfe, especially Book of the New Sun. And with Mycroft Canner, she does a good job of giving this guy many narratorial and reliabilities. You don't even know what he's convicted for like a book or two, to the point where like once you finally figure out, you're like, wait, what? I just think he is such a treat. There's so much I love about this series and so much I could talk about it. I just keep getting lost in thought. If I don't have a clean hook for this series, well, it's just because there's so much to talk about that I can't talk about it in this tiny little space. Sorry. Number 5 is Downward to the Earth by Robert Silverberg. Robert Silverberg has a very long career. He has written many incredible novels. This was the first one of his I read, and this is a true post-colonial novel. Humanity has this galactic empire or whatever, and humanity colonized, which is to say enslaved, a world with these aliens who are kind of like sentient talking elephants. And over time, due to galactic pressure, they decolonized the planet. You know, they said, we are giving the planet back to the natives. Good job, humanity. We have done it. But I think we all know that that's not really where colonization ends, right? Just because you free a country from its obvious shackles doesn't mean that you release it from its inner shackles. This follows a man who used to be an administrator on that planet who is absolutely racked with guilt for being a cog in the machine. He wasn't the number one guy doing oppression, but that's not the point. Which is to say, that's exactly the point. He is just a normal guy who's doing his job, but being able to reflect realizes, I have done one of the greatest sins that a person could do to another person. How do I make it right? How do I make amends? So Downward to the Earth is the story of him returning to this planet after 10 years and trying to find answers and trying to find salvation. It's just like a beautiful, very interior psychological novel that has some incredible psychedelia in it. Number 4, Speaker for the Dead by Orson Scott Card. Most people recommend Ender's Game, which this is technically a sequel to, but more accurately, Ender's Game is a prequel to this. I grew up reading Ender's Game as a precocious youth who felt misunderstood by the people around me, and so my dad handed me a copy when I was like 6 years old. When I was a kid, I didn't read the adult Ender books because, well, they seemed too adult for me. And I am really happy that I waited until my adulthood to actually read Speaker for the Dead, because I feel like that gave me a perspective on the story that I would not have had otherwise. Speaker for the Dead follows Ender Wiggin thousands of years after the events of Ender's Game, which have deeply traumatized him. He is deeply invested in alien life throughout the galaxy and in its sanctity. Even though it's thousands of years afterwards, he is still only in his 50s or whatever due to relativistic space travel, because he spends most of his life zipping from planet to planet at near light speeds. At the end of Ender's Game, he sort of accidentally creates a secular religion where instead of having a religious sermon after someone dies, a detective type person called the Speaker for the Dead comes to a place, investigates everything about a person's life, and they give a fully researched and neutral eulogy with all of the good and the bad, presenting their life to the community so that they have the full chance to grieve. Meanwhile, on the planet Lusitania, Portuguese-descended colonists have discovered the first alien life that humanity has encountered since the Formix in Ender's Game. They have kind of porcine features, so they are called piggies. The xenobiologists have this uneasy relationship trying to find out about these aliens without disturbing their native culture. One of the xenobiologists who is investigating these aliens makes a huge revelation. He runs off. He's about to make a huge breakthrough. Then he dies. Or rather, he is absolutely butchered by these aliens. The xenobiologist's colleague and love interest, in absolute distress about what happens, calls for a speaker for the dead. Ender Wiggin, our protagonists, get summoned to this planet. But here's the problem. Again, due to near light speed relativistic travel, it takes him 22 years to get to the planet. And so by the time he gets there, all of the grief and trauma from this event is fully embedded in the community, as well as their relations with the local aliens, and they are deeply unwilling to really help along in his investigation of not just the man's life, but of these aliens. What makes Speaker for the Dead such a fascinating and magical book is that it balances a cracking good alien mystery with this deeply sensitive story of intergenerational family trauma and just like trying to unpack the layers of grief that have permeated through this community. In short, this is one of the single most empathetic science fiction books I have ever read, which preaches an ethos of universal love and kindness that makes it all the more saddening and ironic that Orson Scott Card is now known today for his deeply homophobic politics. I wish we still had that Orson Scott Card today, rather than the Orson Scott Card who wrote that stupid novella about how if Obama got elected, armed thugs would run through the streets killing good Christians or whatever. Number 3, The Female Man by Joanna Russ, the GOAT It was a hard decision to choose between this or We Who Are About To, which is another novel that she wrote, but I think this one impacted me a little more deeply, and also it's the one that I have a copy of. So this is the one that I'm presenting. Joanna Russ, maybe the most underrated science fiction writer of the 1960s and the 1970s. She was a contemporary with Ursula K. Le Guin, but unlike Le Guin, Joanna Russ was a militant lesbian. Her examinations of gender go even further, they're much harsher, and so because of that, the two of them had kind of this uneasy rivalry where, you know, Joanna Russ is like, Ursula K. Le Guin goes way too easy on men, and Ursula K. Le Guin's like, Joanna Russ just needs to chill out. The thing you take away from reading Joanna Russ's works is like, A, maybe she does need to chill out, but also she is entirely justified in how furious and angry that she is. The Female Man is a work about 3 and later 4 women from parallel universes who, due to the blending of dimensions, come to interact with each other. And we are to understand that all 4 of these women are reflections on Joanna Russ herself. Of the first one, you have Joanna, who is a depressed lesbian academic in our Earth who is minimized and disregarded by her male colleagues. Janine is from this parallel Earth where the Great Depression went on forever and basically second wave feminism never took root. Janet is from this, you know, seeming utopia where all men died, this lesbian paradise, but they still have all these like unsettling social mores that you could really dig down to. And then eventually meet Jael, who is from a world where men and women are in active warfare. And basically, by the 4 of these women interacting, they are sort of able to reflect on women's place in the world. It's written in this postmodern style, which a lot of people find difficult to parse. Like, it jumps around a lot. There is this one chapter where like 3 pages are told from the point of view of a bedpost, and I had to like reread it over and over again because I couldn't comprehend that a bedpost was like the narrator for that one scene. The way she is able to write men not being cartoonishly evil, mind you, but just being casually shitty is so deeply true to life. Like, you can tell that it's drawn from actual interactions that she had at these different like awful New York house parties. My favorite part, the part that moved me the most, was actually the very end where Joanna Russ breaks the 4th wall to wish for a day where her book will be such a product of its time that no one will relate to it anymore. I think I'll just read it right here. Go, little book. Trot through Texas and Vermont and Alaska and Maryland and Washington and Florida and Canada and England and France. Bob a curtsy at the shrines of Friedan, Millet, Greer, Firestone, and all the rest. Behave yourself in people's living rooms, neither looking ostentatious on your coffee table nor failing to persuade due to the dullness of your style. Knock at the Christmas garland on my husband's door in New York City and tell him that I loved him truly and love him still, despite what anybody may think. And take your place bravely on the book racks of bus terminals and drugstores. Do not scream when you are ignored, for that will alarm people. And do not fume when you are heisted by persons who will not pay. Rather rejoice that you have become so popular. Live merrily, little daughter book. Even if I can't and we can't, recite yourself to all who will listen. Stay hopeful and wise. Wash your face and take your place without a fuss in the Library of Congress, for all books end up there eventually, both little and big. Do not complain when at last you have become quaint and old-fashioned, when you grow as outworn as the crinolines of a generation ago and are classed with spicy Western stories, Elsie Dinsmore and the Son of the Sheik. Do not mutter angrily to yourself when young persons read you to hooch and hurch and guffaw, wondering what the dickens you are all about. Do not get glum when you are no longer understood, little book. Do not curse your fate. Do not reach up from the reader's laps and punch the reader's noses. Rejoice, little book, for on that day we will be free. Number 2, The God Emperor of Dune by Frank Herbert. Everyone always says Dune is so good, but the further it gets, the worse and worse it becomes. It just becomes too out there and too weird. Well, no. God Emperor of Dune is the greatest book ever written of all time. And it is such a singular work of human achievement that it stuns me to this day that it exists at all. Obviously, I will have to gently spoil the shape of the later Dune books in order to get to this one. God Emperor of Dune takes place 4,000 years after the first Dune. Due to shenanigans, Paul Atreides' son, named Leto Atreides II, has turned himself into a giant sandworm. He is a giant, immortal sandworm who rules the galaxy with an iron fist. When you clacka online about God Emperor of Dune into YouTube, Dune lore explained! Dune lore gets so twisted! But you have very few people actually talking about the book as a book. And that really pisses me off because A, lore YouTubers should be shot into the sun. And B, it just undersells like what an interesting and fascinating book this really is. Because you have our protagonist who is a giant psychic worm man. A lot of people argue he is one of the least relatable characters in all of fiction. Because A, he is a giant worm man, he has full psychic vision of the future, he has the ancestral memories of basically everyone who ever lived on Earth, so he can fully see into the past as well, and so he nearly has the whole knowledge of human experience. And so, because he is like so bored ruling the galaxy with an iron but fair fist, he keeps resurrecting Duncan Idaho, aka Jason Momoa from the movies. He keeps cloning him over and over again just so that he'll have someone to talk to as both a friend and deepest enemy. So a lot of the book is him getting into these circular discussions with Jason Momoa about justice and politics and sociology and whatnot. And eventually Jason Momoa will get so fed up that he will either try to kill Leto, which he will fail at and die, or he will kill himself. Meanwhile, you have all these Dune factions, you know, the Bene Gesserit, the Bene Tleilaxu, the Merchants Guild, the Ixians, who all don't like Leto. If they don't stay in line, then they don't get any spice. And that is how he sort of maintains their obedience. But they all hate him and they're all scheming against him. And so one of their big coups in this book, maybe this will destabilize Leto, they make a new ambassador for Leto's court, which they have genetically modified to be his perfect anime girlfriend. And she is named Hui Nori, as Simon Vance says in the audiobook. So Leto II sees Hui Nori and he immediately realizes, oh my god, these bastards have designed my perfect anime girlfriend. But I could never be with her because I am a giant worm man with no dick. Not only that, but I keep resurrecting Jason Momoa. Jason Momoa is gonna hook up with my anime girlfriend. Should I just kill myself? That mental struggle is bizarrely one of the most relatable things that I have ever read. Such a bizarrely human element. So yeah, God Emperor is so awesome. Number 1 is The Carpet Makers by Andreas Eschbach. This is a premier work of German science fiction written in the 1990s. I think of The Carpet Makers as actually kind of a response to God Emperor of Dune, where it looks at that kind of universe with the despotic emperor and whatnot, and it looks at it from the ground level going up. The Carpet Makers is a novel about a world. On this world, there are communities of people who spend their whole lives making carpets of human hair. Stray hairs from their wives and daughters, and they spend their entire lives intricately needling these hairs together into these giant carpets of human hair, after which they sell them to a trader, and then the trader sells them to the emperor, or at least that's what they're told. The galactic emperor supposedly loves to line his palaces with human hair. What makes the book so fascinating is that it's actually a collection of linked short stories where every single chapter follows a different character and pulls out the camera ever so slightly away from one of these villages that makes hair carpets. First, you're looking at the lives of different people in the village. What is it like for one of these hair carpet merchants? What is it like for the tax collector who is making sure that everyone's numbers are right? What happens with the people whose job it is to transport these carpets off-world? Let me tell you, every single one of these stories ends absolutely horribly. A tale of grief and suffering for everyone involved. It's very clear that this system benefits absolutely no one. But as the camera pulls back more and more from a village scale to a regional scale to a planetary scale to a galactic scale to a universal scale, it makes you wonder, what are these carpets actually for? Because it's obvious that the story that everyone is being fed ain't the real story. When you finally figure it out, it's devastating. In short, I would say that The Carpet Makers is my favorite science fiction novel of all time because it encapsulates the classic George Orwell quote from 1984. Do you want to know the future of humanity? Imagine a boot stomping on the face of the human race forever. That's my final rec. Hopefully I can edit this together over the next week or two while I am traveling on my vacay. There was lots of interest in me doing a top 15 manga video, but I decided to do a science fiction list first because I have read most manga in my life digitally, and I wanted to try to get some physical copies, not only to have something that I can show for the camera, but also just so that I can support the official releases and whatnot before I recommend them fully. By golly, Miss Molly, it is so dark out. I recorded in the afternoon rather than the morning, so that's why it has slowly been getting darker and darker as I keep talking. But thank you for watching my video. Love you.